Welcome back, everybody. It's Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. It is Sunday. It is the final part of our New Frontier breakdown, the eighth and final piece of this, Mike. So, chapters 15 through the end of this one. Darwyn has 17 chapters and there's an epilogue, but these got a little shorter. And so we just figured we'd do one last kind of chunk to finish it out. This is part of our Watchmen challenge. The first contender against Watchmen is the New Frontier. Again, Mike and I are spending the next year breaking down some classics, comparing and contrasting to Watchmen. We're trying to answer the goal: what's the greatest comic of all time? Mike, a story in the New Frontier that Darwyn Cooke had a very specific purpose for. He found kind of a missing gap of time, but with comic books bridging that gap between, really the gold, silver age, and all of that. A really interesting time period, given what happened in the world, and we finally arrive at the end with the ultimate attack on the center and all of our heroes uniting. Just the finale of it, Mike. So we set up the last part that we ended with part 7 was the apparent death of Superman, and this one opens with Lois Lane talking about the apparent death of Superman. How'd you feel about this finale, the ending? We'll kind of summarize the events and then just sort of put some final thoughts on this one.
Wow. So what a cliffhanger, we get this brief little thing at the end of the last chapter where, we get all a little introduction as to why the other heroes of the era were kind of sitting this one out. And just really a good excuse for Darwyn to kind of draw those characters that he couldn't fit into his story. Granted, I feel that if he had been given, a full 12 issue series, that he would have found a way to work them in. But it was truncated, right? And even though it was truncated like it was it 6 issues? Is that what it was?
Yeah, this came out across 6 issues.
What a
I know he had
masterful,
some epilogue issues and things that came later, but the main series, yeah, about 6 issues total.
what a great epic series. And then you got to just enjoy the color scheme of the first page with Lois Lane. And I just, took a minute to read this. I mean, of course, Lois, everyone saw, and she says, America's greatest champion, the mighty Superman, went down in defeat several hours ago. He is gone. This reporter was witness to his flaming body being swallowed up by the Atlantic, and an exhaustive search has left no sign of his having survived his battle with the center. And then she goes on to in a report, and then this is such a touching panel where Lois, she just can't go on,
Mhm.
you know? And look at the expression on her face. It's just so beautifully done. I mean, just
Yeah, I
captures
think
the moment.
Darwyn is such a good artist. I think there's several shots like this in the finale where he captures human emotion so well that mix perfectly with the comic book. And I think, we're contrasting it with Watchmen, and obviously, you got Gibbons' art on the other end, which is really fantastic as well. But where I will always give Darwyn credit, and oh yes, even sometimes for me, I wouldn't put Darwyn in the greatest artists of all time. And then you read something like this, and you realize how talented he is, and that he has this very unique, very dynamic style that almost seems, and you can tell why he was in animation, in that his ability to draw faces in a way that feels like you're reading a cartoon almost in some of these panels that captures things. It's amazing. I think that shot of Lois so does that. The desperation on the faces of the heroes at the beginning of this chapter, the way that he captures it all. I don't think he ever gets enough credit for how great an artist he is. Because
You
he
know,
so many
it
different characters. It's crazy.
it's his style.
Mm,
And he is very stylized. It's uniquely his. Um, I will invoke the great King of Comics, Jack Kirby. And
mhm.
his style was so uniquely his that he often got criticized for not drawing more naturally or with an illustrator's approach. And he never changed, thank God.
Mhm.
And neither did Darwyn. He just got better, although we only got, a few brief years of his comic book drawing career. from say like 98 to, when he passed. When did he pass? 2010?
It
Uh,
was sometime in the last 10 years. Yeah, he passed.
just like, 12 or 15 years, where of course Kirby, drew for 50 years. But Kirby never changed, but he got a lot of flack for that style because others, drew more naturally and a realistic, quote unquote. But
Hmm.
that doesn't mean you can't draw a good story. And that doesn't mean you can't fall in love with the way that these artists rendered their characters in the way that they did, as stylized as they did. And you absolutely, by the end of this book, you fall in love with Darwin's style because it's so amazing. And it's so uniquely his. And it's just, it's wonderful. Once you can, if you can get past that, then you can enjoy the book on the multiple levels and understand the genius that he both, wrote and drew this book. And that's just a heft that modern creators normally don't do, or the old creators for that matter. They normally just penciled, or they were inkers, or they were colorists, and sometimes there was crossover between inkers and pencilers. But but yeah, so
Right?
we
Just
get we get
there's
into
so
the
many cool
story.
shots in here. These pinups and 2-page spreads, and we haven't mentioned yet, but Dave Stewart, who's the colorist, and that's our bad for not bringing him up yet. I mean, even that, some of the change. I mean, this shot of Green Lantern with the Guardians in the background that
Oh,
shows up in this last portion.
I,
The thing that's so cool is it's posters. They the pinups, but I mean, this is poster artwork of something you'd expect if you were a Green Lantern fan to have. There's that fantastic 2-page spread of when the heroes are preparing to attack and you see him kind of walking across the helicarrier, arm in arm, ready to go. And it's just he does such a good job of capturing moments that are cinematic, that just feel real. And I thought he did such a good job with that. But never losing touch of the character moments. I love the scene in this where like they're trying to apologize to Barry for trying to capture him like no hard feelings, and
and
then
he
Barry's
slugs
like
him.
Barry decks the guy, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's even in these larger than life circumstances where we're fighting this gigantic, enormous, his characters always feel real. They don't feel cartoony. They don't feel distant. And there's stuff in this last chapter. I mean, one that really was a unique situation where you have King Faraday and Martian Manhunter in that relationship reaching ahead as far as the friendship they built, where King Faraday ultimately dies in this chapter. Those moments are really emotionally resonant because, and I think this is where when we get into that point of comparing to Watchmen, where you have to give Darwyn Cooke credit is he didn't waste panel time either. What we have always credited Watchmen for is these small interactions in Watchmen, like the newspaper vendor and the kid who's reading the comic book at his stand. When you're first reading it, you kind of go like, what is the point of this in the story? And then in chapter 11, when Ozymandias' plan gets in there and that fake thing happens and you see those two killed, you're like, that is what this was leading to the whole time. In Darwyn, that moment with King Faraday and Martian Manhunter, you're like, this is why those pages mattered so much. And it hits you as a reader.
Mhm.
There's some genuinely emotional sort of moments in this that,
It really comes
not
off.
tearjerker, but certainly where you're like, man, that hits the feels a little bit.
I would like to talk about the other part of Darwin's style in this book. And in most comic book pages, you get 6 to 9 panels. Darwin gives you 3 panels and maybe, a cluster of other smaller ones.
Mm-hmm.
But the advantage to this style, number one, it plays to his artwork, but number two, it lets you absorb the picture in a more, you can appreciate the pictures more,
Mm-hmm.
rather than having to just, kind of filter out the picture from the word balloons and then move to the next panel. I mean, you get to take a minute and take the scene in. And I don't know if anybody else really does it like that. Like normally, if you were going to do a big expressive panel, you would have, you divide, like have 6 small panels and then one big third panel, or vice versa. But Darwin's, this lower panel right here would be a throwaway tiny panel like the upper ones there in a normal comic. But just look at the emotion and the expression. I mean, you get to look at that character, the expression on his face, appreciate it for what it is. And it just, the format he puts it in, just, it lets you appreciate the artwork, is what I'm saying. But the
For sure.
story, I mean, is just great. I mean, they're caring for Martian Manhunter, and they know he's going through it, and Faraday understands it, and Faraday thinks he's going to get Martian Manhunter all the way to the center to help with the fight. And of course, the big moment is that, John Jones, breaks down and becomes consumed with the center. He can't take it anymore. And
Hmm.
the poignant moment that you talked about is that Faraday, absorbs that somehow and pays the ultimate price.
Yeah, no, I think where Darwin gets so much credit, and we talk about this in any time you read a comic book run, I think especially something like this, it's like as you've always described this is like a tome kind of thing. This was his magnus opus kind of thing. The same way that Watchmen is this very thick, very, meaty story that's there. This is similar to that. And the most important part of any story like that is, do you stick the landing? Is what you were trying to say, is it worth it? Do you do the build up correctly? Do you deliver? And there's so many comics that don't. I think one of the things is when we go through these stories, some of these ones that are the all time greats, the thing that I think will differentiate the ones that finish 10th, 11th, and the ones that finish first and second is who finishes with the flourish, where you're like, whoa, that was an incredible ending. Because there's so many that you're like, man, the first 90% is amazing, and the last 10 pages kind of felt like they didn't know what to do. And this comic, that build up after Superman's taken on the board, where they're kind of in the briefing room, you can sense the tension, you can sense the dread, the sense of foreboding that's in those panels, the facial expressions on characters like King Faraday and Barry Allen and Green Arrow, where like, we're gonna go do this, but you can tell they think they're headed to their doom. And it's a brilliant way that Darwin draws those and draws you in as a reader. It felt very similar. It's kind of like that the attack on the Death Star at the end of Star Wars, where it kind of feels like this 1,000,000 to 1 shot that they have to take down the center. And the pages you get, these incredible pages from Darwin of the attack on the center, where you just have so much color and dynamic stuff happening throughout. I mean, he just gets stuff like this in here, and this is just on this compact one, but it's so colorful, dynamic, unique. It showcases the powers of the characters so well. The use of Green Lantern and Flash and Adam Strange and these different characters. He knew what he was doing at this end point, and it's so weird in that, typically in a DC story, if you were watching the grand finale of the DC universe, your expectation is it's Batman and Superman back to back fighting out for the end, and those two are nowhere to be found here. And yet you still are like, man, this was a word. That was the thing that struck me so much. In that, I think when I read it when I was younger, I'm like, okay, it's the big finale. It's when's the bat plane breaking through the sky? Doesn't happen. And it makes sense. Batman wouldn't be able to do much against this
No.
opponent. And such a credit to Darwin that he employed some of these characters that he did, like John and the Challengers and Adam Strange and Green. I thought that was so impressive. What are your thoughts on the overall kind of attack and how he did that, Mike?
Um, you nailed it when you said, the two usual suspects are completely off the board, and even the third because Diana's out, you
Yeah,
know?
she's all injured. Yeah.
And so you're left with this motley crew of hodgepodge heroes, some of them that don't like one another. Um, and I forget what part it was with the speech, we might not make it back. And they all know, I mean, that was a horrible blow seeing Superman just get obliterated and he's gone. He's out of there and it's hours. He's not coming back. They tried searching for him. He's gone. And so they have to, they have to take this approach, which is the plan with Ray Palmer. And it's so funny how Adam Strange, one of his caretakers lets him out of the loony bin and gives him his pistol back,
Mhm.
and he goes and picks up Ray Palmer at his house and says, that thing that you have. He goes, yeah, but it's unstable. It's not. He goes, exactly. Bring it to us, and takes him to the Cape where they're all trying to make a plan. And of course, Flash is integral to the plan, so I like that part.
Well, and
And
I think that you're so correct on like how he sets these characters up, and that Mike, I thought the most fascinating thing, because I didn't know this as much until you really educated me on the history of comic books more. As much as Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman are the big three, you can argue in the Silver Age it's Barry Allen and Hal Jordan that saved the superhero comic book, and I think
yeah,
it's incredibly cool that Darwin built that in.
and the previous issue, it's all about Hal just like learning to work his ring as he's on the way to maybe, being Green Lantern in full for the first time. So this is all just, it's so cool because, these characters were all dead in the water in, 1955, 56. They were nowhere to be found. I mean, Green Lantern had to be reimagined, Flash had to be reimagined. All this stuff hadn't come to be yet. And here comes Darwin telling the story of like, hey, this is how it could have happened. And all of us are going, wow, this is really cool. The colorist had fun on this issue, right?
Yeah, Dave Stewart for sure,
I
for sure.
mean, really showing your colorist chops there. He must have had a field day. I mean, it's amazing. He did a wonderful job.
No,
Um,
it's so cool how Darwin. One of the things that you point out on this story that I never gave him credit for when I was reading the first time, because you forget the context somewhat. Some novels and some books have these historically significant things attached to them, that the distance of it, you have to consider that when you read it. It's kind of like a book like Les Miserables, where that book, it's a great book on its own, but when you consider what that meant at the time when that was released, and what the conditions that Victor Hugo released that into politically and socially and all of that, that book has a heck of a lot more meaning than just, the Jean Valjean piece that we all enjoy when we
yeah,
read the book now. I think with Darwin, him touching on this story of the flash and the desperation and the darkness that was there, and how it's ultimately, you have a lot of characters, but ultimately Barry and Hal Jordan are the most two significant pieces that save this. I'm so amazed how he worked that in, given the condition that the comics were in this era. And that you've always made this argument, and largely I think you can't really counter it too much, without Showcase #4, where Barry Allen shows up, we might not have the superhero comic as it is, because Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, they were the only three still standing, but they were barely surviving, and it was going to fail. And then Hal Jordan, his appearance in that the same
Showcase
era,
22.
22, Hal's appearance was that second step that was needed to confirm this wasn't a one hit wonder with Barry. We've got some momentum, and the superhero comic kicks back up. And I think you've always made that point that, we kind of owe those two comics for why we have Marvel comic books. That all the comic book companies were publishing romance and war stories and horror. And it wasn't until those two characters hit with audience, these golden age characters that were completely redesigned head to toe with new costumes, new power sets. And it's so cool that Darwin has in his story covering the bridge of what happened in that period, that it is ultimately those two that turn the tide. And I have to imagine he 100% did that intentionally. But that's one of those cool things historically, context wise. You're like, dang, man, that's a lot deeper than you have it credit for.
How do you like, Green Lantern outracing the atomic explosion inside the center?
Mm-hmm.
That not cool or what?
No, just great character moments with it, and you kind of get, Mike. You were talking about how much you liked the ending of the JFK speech that Darwin sort of closes us on. I knew that hit you when you were reading it. How did you feel about that speech being integrated and what it said about the story and the state of the world?
Well, okay, so we get the typical superhero ending where, you know, I mean, but it wasn't typical. I mean, this was an insurmountable object. And, you took the biggest pieces off the board. And then Hal Jordan and Barry Allen along with Ray Palmer's device, they end up figuring out a way to save the day. It was amazing. It looked like, it wasn't going to happen, but then it did. And so we get the typical end to a comic book. Yes, the hero saved the day. And then you're thinking back to yourself, man, that was such a great story. It was a superhero story. It was really, really good. And then you get these panels with John F. Kennedy's New Frontier speech,
Mm.
the next several pages with pictures of America and the heroes, and they break it up bit by bit. And it just really started to impact me as to why he was telling the story he was. And I think it was twofold. Number one, to speak to the aspirational side of our country and our nation, which has endured for, 250 plus years, right? And we have, whatever our differences are and whatever which ways we go, we have to understand that we are this unique country that is aspirational, and we have these founding principles that should guide us all. And Kennedy was really trying to hearken the country back together from where it was as things were kind of breaking apart in his time when he gave that speech. And it spoke volumes to me about our current state, but the underlying thing of it, and maybe that was the underlying thing, and the overlaying element of using that speech to end this story was very prescient because it was an end of an era then, and the heroes had been driven into seclusion, either both really and in fiction as well. So in the fictional world, like in Watchmen, the heroes were driven underground. It was illegal to be an adventurer or whatever they used to call it, right? In Watchmen, superhero adventuring was outlawed. But also in the real world of comics, um, a certain kind of comics storytelling was also virtually outlawed, which drove comics almost to the brink of collapse, the whole industry. So it kind of had twofold of an approach to me, but I really understanding Darwin and who he was, he always wanted to bring that aspirational part of heroes back to comics. He always felt that they had gone too dark, that the characters were unrecognizable. It wasn't good for kids, and like you've always said, it should be good to read for adults and kids, like it was back in the day, and it should be. And so maybe it actually had three layers to it, using that John Kennedy speech. Man, it just really drove it home. And for whatever your political leanings are, if you go back and read this speech of John F. Kennedy and just think about it as a speech from one American to another, it really hits home. And it tied the story together, I thought, beautifully.
No, there's something poignant to it where you understand this was a great superhero story, but was also sort of a message, like a lot of great pieces of fiction that Darwin was trying to send. And you could say it's about human condition. You could say it's about the comic book industry. You could say it's about a lot of different things, but there's no question it hits you a different way no matter what perspective you're looking at it. And that's, I think, what separates the great artists of this industry and any industry is that we talk so much about this now about social issues being touched upon in comic books. And the thing is, most of us now don't like it when they do it because they lack the subtlety that Darwin had of this is a fantastic comic book story on its own. If you just took the pages with zero context politically of anything that's going on, you're like, man, that's a heck of a story. And then you throw the other layer, and that's what Darwin does so well of like, oh, but there's actually a really great message to this too. of hope and inspiration and unity and some of the scary things that were happening at the time, and really an unfiltered look at what the world was like back then, and how in some levels we were absolutely amazing and aspirational. On others, we were shockingly failing to that standard, but still trying. And I think the Kennedy speech ties into that perfectly. And that Kennedy is a figure, like you said, regardless of your personal opinions of him, the man crafted some amazing speeches. He knew how to spin a yarn as far as an inspirational speech that as an American or any citizen of a country you'd read and go, man, like that guy makes you feel like you want to get off your couch and go do something. And I think his use of that really ties something poignant to this story in the way a lot of great pieces of fiction do, like some of the great classic novels of all time, and certainly some of the comic books that have really registered with fans.
Yeah, and after that wonderful story, which was all about, the having to get the team together and work together, um, for them to save the country and the world. It was just so very fitting. And he was a child of that generation, um, so it just fit beautifully, and he named the whole book out of it. I pulled that right out of the speech where John Kennedy says, and this beautiful double page spread
Of all of our
after they
DC
won the
fans, yeah.
battle and they're going for it. I mean, that's just stunning, right?
Hmm.
Absolutely stunning. And there's your boy Batman in the front there.
Finally
Um,
gets the clearance, yeah.
yeah, so he wasn't gone for long, but he says that is the question of the new frontier. That is the choice of our nation must make between the public interest and the private comfort, between the national greatness and national decline, between the fresh air of progress and the state of and the stale, dank atmosphere of normalcy, between determined dedication and creeping mediocrity. All mankind waits upon our decision. A whole world looks to see what we will do. We cannot fail their trust. We cannot fail to try. And that's what they did. They couldn't fail. They tried, and they overcame the evil center. And then there's this wonderful, fanciful little part here of recreation of Brave and the Bold 29 when the
Hmm.
Justice League started,
With
and then
Starro,
they are
yeah.
fighting Starro.
No,
And he,
it's such a cool ending to the story, and I think if we directly contrast this with Watchmen, which we'll do a whole video talking about that. This is a comic book where I will always give the New Frontier credit, and I don't know where it'll end up on our list, as you and I are going to spend this week kind of debating its place amongst Watchmen, and then as we go through this, we're going to end up with a list somewhere. No matter where this one ends up on the list, what I will say is it is a comic book that makes you feel good at the end. It's a comic book that reminds you of why these heroes are so great and why these characters they touch upon timeless themes. I think that's one thing that you and I have talked about that's sort of been lost in superheroes, and Darwyn Cooke certainly talked about this in real life too, about comic books is we want to be inspired by these characters. They're fun and there's escapism, and it's fantastic to have that. But part of why you and I are the age that we are and we're still reading these comic books is
yeah,
as adults, life's hard, man. Like, I know, I love my life. I love my kids. I love my wife. I have a fantastic, but work beats you down, and the world throws some ugly stuff at you sometimes, and you don't always. And these comic books, silly as it may seem, those little 20-page breaks that you get flipping these things open, diving into the world of a DC Comics thing where it is Batman goes and punches the bad guy and wins. And sometimes that's okay for you to just enjoy that. And I love that Darwyn was able to do a deeper theme, but also just deliver something where you're like, that's cool. I feel better about superheroes and story and entertainment. And that's something I think Watchmen doesn't do as much, obviously, because it
no,
wasn't striving to, but
yeah,
it's a very poignant ending that also leaves you slightly uplifted. And I have to
yeah.
give Darwyn a ton of credit in that. I remember reading the last page of that book this time, and just a big smile creeping across my face of like, man, that's cool. And it's rare that you get a story that does that anymore.
So let me ask you this about Darwin. He always preached for this, and then he got an opportunity to actually put his money where his mouth was, and then he delivered this. And when did this come out? 2004, 2000?
Yeah, it's almost 20 years old at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and if Darwin, wherever you're watching, we'll put it like this. Um, and with all that we've been through a couple of years doing this show and always asking for comics to reboot in this way,
Hmm.
um, do you think that this story now it came out, got re-released in the compact edition? Do you
Hmm.
think this will? Do you think Darwin was just ahead of his time, and that this is really coming for comics? Because a lot of the newer stories seem to be kind of going that way. Some of the more successful ones.
I'm hopeful that it is, and I think with sadly with Darwin being passed, I would hope a story like this could be something that modern comic book fans read and go, man, I want more of that. And I think
Yeah.
that's the coolest thing of this is Darwin Cooke, as an animator and as all these different things, he had a passion for these stories. And one of the cool things about comic books is we've been littered with stories and history of comic book writers and artists who were almost sort of ashamed or shamed by the medium that they worked for. Stan Lee talked in great detail about that, about how as a comic book writer, he kind of lied about what his job was because he didn't want people to think of, oh, these silly pages that he writes and all that. What Darwin Cook always seemed
Also,
is, go ahead, Mike.
also, also after the Scourge
Hmm.
in the 50s, it became, a black mark on you if you were, people shunned you at parties, apparently. Several creators of the era have testified to that, where people would speak to them after they told them what they did for a living.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
And I think what's so cool with Darwin is Darwin, when you hear him interviewed in the past and when he talked about this, he was a guy who fully understood the potential of the medium. He understood this is something that connects fathers and sons. This is something that as adults you still get that little inspiration from it. That yes, it's stupid that Spider-Man and Batman can be something you learn a lesson from because they're largely fictional characters in their long underwear punching bad guys.
Oh,
But
yeah.
he also understood there's power in those stories of teaching small lessons like great power, great responsibility, and a role model like Superman who teaches you, hey, if you have authority and power, you use that to serve others, not oppress others. And he understood that. And this is where I do hope people take from this, like you said, rereading it. This is the kind of comics we need now. There's so many people who want to say something with their comics. And all it largely ends up being is them speaking into an echo chamber of people who believe exactly as they do, and with the hope of, hey, you'll echo my opinions. Darwin delivered a universal message of hope, of inspiration, of this is why these are great. It's a fantastic ending. And I'll be
And it
fascinated next
didn't,
week when we kind of tie in and try to compare this to Watchmen, where we end up ranking it.
yeah, it's diametrically opposed, right? But it didn't lack for fun. That was the other thing. You
100%.
got lots of great action. And I think that's something that modern creators kind of falsely believe, that if you get too aspirational, it's not going to be any fun. It's going to be preachy. But
Yeah.
no, it's not.
No, it's certainly a heck of an ending. For those who followed along, let us know your thoughts on the end of The New Frontier. That'll wrap up our breakdown of that. Next week, fun one for Mike and I. We're going to take this week, really look at this and Watchmen, compare and contrast, and try to answer in a ranking sense what would be one, what would be two, and then we'll be kicking into the third part of our next one. Again, we're going to go through about 10 graphic novels. I believe we're pivoting to Batman Year One after this, the Frank Miller classic. That one's a little shorter, but we certainly wanted to give that one a shot as well. But let us know your thoughts down below, folks. We hope you enjoyed the journey through this one. We'll be back next week for that first kind of Watchmen challenge where we rank it and see where we end up. As always, folks, God bless you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching.
Thanks, everybody.